Greetings once again to those joining us from around the world. My name is Merritt Johnston, and I'm honored to serve as the Executive Director of Baptist World Alliance Women, a sisterhood of women in more than 140 countries, networking together for greater global impact. We're so thankful to co-sponsor today's session with For Women's Alliance, which is a global community of religious freedom and human rights activists advancing freedom of religion or belief for women worldwide. So on behalf of Baptist World Alliance Women and For Women's Alliance, we welcome you to our virtual event today addressing women and girls in the digital world. We are grateful for this opportunity to connect with you and to learn together. As we journey through this session, we invite you to engage through our polls and also with our panel by sharing your questions in the Q&A section. You should see some little question comment bubbles icon there, and you can click on that Q&A section to share your questions with us, and that will make this a collaborative time together as we respond to those questions. This session is part of the 67th United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which is centered this year on innovation and technological change and education in the digital age to achieve gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. Within that theme, the United Nations has emphasized 4 primary goals as part of the Power On movement. So I want us to take just a quick look at those goals.
In the digital age, our systems still perpetuate bias, inequality, and violence in the lives of women and girls. Technological progress is outpacing progress towards gender equality. This is not progress. On this International Women's Day, we make 4 calls. 1. Remove all barriers to access the digital world. 2. Educate and train women and girls in STEM. 3. Enable women to create tech that meets their needs. 4. Eliminate online gender-based violence. Today we power on to create an equal digital future for all.
So we're grateful for that incredible video from the UN. And in today's session, we will be focusing on the 4th goal, eliminating online gender-based violence. Although digital forms of violence against women and girls are relatively new, they are part of an age-old continuum of gender-based violence across all contexts. Online platforms have become enabling environments for violence against women with factors like anonymity, affordability, and impunity, creating a dangerously conducive combination. Girls are particularly vulnerable, with most reporting their first experience of social media harassment between the ages of 14 to 16. As the mother to a young daughter myself and a minister who has worked with young women for more than 20 years, it's devastating to see the impact of the shadow side of technology. Cyber violence, including stalking, trolling, cyber harassment, and bullying, image-based sexual abuse. These are all too frequent realities for girls around the world. In preparing for this session, we asked girls to share their experiences with us. Understandably, they did not feel comfortable sharing their faces on screen, but we've put together a video with their words, and we'd love to share a few of their stories with you now.
Cyberbullying happened to me last year. I posted a picture on Instagram with me and my dog. Then I got a lot of unknown text messages on my phone about how I looked as ugly as my dog.
High school is hard enough without cyberbullying. It's real and we deal with it all the time. I'm afraid to post something that could be taken the wrong way or post something I thought was innocent and it be turned against me. I've seen so many friends make terrible choices because of one mean and unnecessary comment.
When I was a freshman, I got some good news. I was jumping up and down with my friend because I was so excited. Some guys took pics of us, and one of the pictures wasn't very flattering of me. My mouth was open and my eyes were closed. The picture was sent through Snapchat to our friend group, and the comments made about me were not very nice. They were very dirty, and I was completely embarrassed.
My friend had a picture of her go viral. We were taking band pictures, and you could see she wasn't sitting very ladylike. Someone took a picture, zoomed in on her, and then shared it everywhere. People still talk about how the picture was shared with so many people. People she didn't even know.
The psychological impact of cyber violence is real. In response to online violence, young women and girls feel physically unsafe, experience lower self-esteem, and often face increasing mental and emotional stress at school. Survivors often experience significant harm to their health and well-being, including increased likelihood of self-harm, depression, and suicidal ideation. And while the stories today that we have shown you originated within the United States, the issue of gender-based violence online is a global issue. So now I'd love to have a quick poll and invite you to answer this question. Have you experienced or know someone who has experienced cyber violence? So we'll give you just a moment to answer that question. Have you experienced yourself or know someone who has experienced cyber violence? So we'll report back to you as we see those results coming in. So feel free to continue to respond there in the poll. We appreciate you sharing your experiences. The statistics indeed are sobering. In a survey across Arab states, 60% of women internet users were exposed to online violence in the last year alone. In the sub-Saharan African states or countries that were surveyed, digital access is sometimes limited, but 28% of those women have already experienced online violence. Research reveals that this issue is also impacting vocational experience. An astounding 73% of women journalists have experienced online violence in the course of their work. 58% of women parliamentarians in Europe say they have been subject to online attacks. But there's more to this issue than stories and statistics. Today, we will hear from those who are serving on the front lines. As you have questions, please again share those in the Q&A section, and we will respond to as many as time allows. We look forward to receiving those questions. But now I'm honored to introduce the facilitator for today's panel, Judy Golub. Judy is co-founder of Forb Women's Alliance and a skilled leader and activist with a keen grasp of coalition building and congressional grassroots and media advocacy. She has more than 40 years of experience as an advocate, planner, researcher, and project manager, and currently serves as an independent consultant and the Director of Strategy and Planning at the Religion News Foundation and Religion News Service. Before that, she directed Congressional Affairs and Policy and Planning at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, served as the Senior Director of Advocacy and Public Affairs at the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the Legislative Director at the American Jewish Committee. All prestigious titles, but I can tell you from personal experience from getting to know Judy over the last year, she has an incredible heart for women, and that is what makes her a unique facilitator for today's time, combining that experience and that passion. And so Judy, I turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Merritt. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you're from. As Merritt said, I'm Judy Golub. I'm co-founder of Forbes Women Alliance. It has been a real pleasure partnering with Merritt Johnson and BWA Women on this important panel, which I'm pleased to moderate. I also want to thank my colleague, Forbes Women's Alliance colleague, Luann Sabatier, for her work on this event. While technology can help enhance gender equality and provide new avenues for women's empowerment, it also has a darker side, and we saw that before. Technology has provided, often with impunity, and that impunity is very important, fertile ground for online digital violence to control, monitor, and harass women, especially women from religious minority communities. With the ever-growing use and importance of the digital context in almost all aspects of life, the threats women and girls experience online profoundly affects them personally, economically, socially, and politically, and often does not stay online. UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women defines such online violence as any act of gender-based violence against women that is committed, assisted, or aggravated in part or fully by the use of information and communication technologies such as mobile phones and smartphones, the internet, email, and social media platforms. What could be timelier today than our panel, Women and Girls in the Digital World, Gender-Based Cyber Violence, to focus on technology-facilitated abuse, that's TFA, and the steps that can be taken to address this abuse. We hope you will find this session engaging, especially given our panelists who are, the first is Dr. Ewelina Ochab. Ewelina is an experienced human rights advocate and legal researcher. She is a co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response, a program lawyer at the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, and a member of the panel of experts at the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. Our second panelist is Catherine Grote. Catherine is a research analyst at Freedom House, focusing on the intersection of technology, democracy, and human rights, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa. She helps produce two of Freedom House's annual publications, Freedom on the Net, which analyzes internet freedom and human rights abuses, and Freedom in the World, which is a global survey of political rights and civil liberties. Our third panelist is Bina Palakal. Bina is Executive Director at the Asia Dalit Rights Forum and the current manager of a program seeking to strengthen Dalit women's economic rights across South Asia. So by the end of this panel, we hope you know more about one, given technology facilitated abuse, what are the connections for women, religious freedom, and human rights? Two, why are these concerns often overlooked or not addressed? And three, what the path forward is. Each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes, then they'll take questions from me, and then they'll take questions from you, the audience. So please be sure to bring your questions into the Q&A during the session. So first up will be Ewelina. She'll present on the rise of gender-based violence generally, the different types of violence that we're talking about, and some international approaches, including laws and policies to address this violence. Catherine will then hone in on gender-based violence with examples from Freedom's House recent report, Freedom on the Net, with a focus on the MENA region. And then Bina will focus on the status of Dalit women, what challenges they face online in India, and how these challenges often migrate offline, in both instances impacting Dalit women in all aspects of their lives. So let's start with Evelina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith, and a big kudos to the whole team for organizing this important session. And thank you very much also for starting with this very powerful video from survivors, young girls. I think growing up is difficult. Being a teenager is difficult for everyone. But for example, I did not grow up in this social media environment. So I definitely didn't face the same pressures as girls face right now. And this is something that I think for many of us, it is difficult to imagine the extra pressures that they face because of the online harassment and gender-based online violence or cyber violence, or however we call it. And just a starting point, I wanted to emphasize that of course, across the world, we use different language in terms of the online cyber violence, harassment, and so on that we'll be discussing here today. But I will try to explain some of the terminology used as well in my presentation. And also very important message that we'll be using data from different reports. So after this session, I will make sure that I shared some of the resources that I will be citing today, but there may be differences in terms of the data, depending on the reports that we use. And I would like to start my presentation in actually citing some of the data available. And according to recent data from the UN, 37% of women do not use internet. 259 million fewer women have access to internet than men, even though they account to nearly half of the world's population. Yet still, women and girls are the main victims of online harassment, online violence, cyber violence, or however we call it. So again, despite the fact that less women and girls are using internet, still they are the main victim of such abuse online, as we'll be discussing shortly. Another study from UN Women suggested that, and it's a study of 51 countries, that 38% of women had personally experienced online harassment. Only 1 in 4 reported it to relevant authorities, and nearly 9 in 10 opted to limit their online activity, thereby, of course, increasing the gender-digital divide that they're already facing in the first instance. And these trends were only exacerbated during the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Another study by Pew Research Center states that women are more likely than men to report having been sexually harassed online or stalked. Young women are particularly likely to have experienced sexual harassment online. 33% of women under 35 say that they have been sexually harassed online, while 11% of men under 35 say the same. And this, for example, Pew Research Center data concerns the situation in the US only, but of course the situation around the world will differ. And the Councils of Europe Gender Equality Strategy for 2018-2023 indicated that there is evidence to show that social media in particular are subject to abusive use, and that women and girls are often confronted with violent and sexualized threats online. Particular platforms acting as conveyors of sexist hate speech include social media or video games. And freedom of expression is often abused as an excuse to cover unacceptable or offensive behavior. And in the same way as with other forms of violence against women, sexist hate speech remains underreported around the world. But its impact on women, whether emotional, psychological, or physical, can be devastating. And of course, we've heard about that in the video that was shown at the very beginning. And such online harassment will only add to the digital gender gap. Again, as I mentioned, some of the statistics at the very beginning, 9 out of 10 women decide that once they face such sexual harassment online, they prefer to not use the internet or to reduce or limit the use of internet and social media. And again, we'll be using different terminology in this sphere, but I will just explain some of the terminology right now. So for example, online harassment does not have a uniform definition and differs especially between jurisdictions. Online harassment generally concerns the use of information and communication technologies by an individual or group to cause harm to another person. And for example, Council of Europe, which is an international organization outside the European Union that defends, protects, and promotes human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Europe. And Council of Europe identifies 3 types of online and technology-facilitated violence against women, including online sexual harassment, online stalking, and psychological violence. And according to the definitions that the Council of Europe uses, online sexual harassment includes cyberflashing or sending unsolicited sexual images, sexualized comments, sexualized defamation, sexualized slander, impersonation for sexual purposes, and doxing, sexualized and gender-based trolling, flaming, mob attacks, image-based sexual harassment such as creep shots, upskirting, which is the sexual or private pictures taken under the skirt or dress without consent and shared online, image-based sexual abuse, including revenge porn, deepfakes, recorded sexual assault and rape, threats and coercion such as forced sexting, sextortion, rape threats, incitement to commit rape. Forms of online stalking, surveilling or spying on social media or messaging, password stealing. These are examples of the acts that fall within the purview of the online stalking as defined by the Council of Europe. And among others, psychological violence as defined by the Council of Europe means online sexist hate speech and incitement to self-harm or suicide, verbal attacks, insults, death threats, blackmail, and many more. So when we talk about online sexual harassment, which is a subcategory of online harassment, we'll be talking about unwanted sexual behavior online. And online sexual harassment may take many different forms, from editing photos to make them sexual, and as was also mentioned by one of the girls in the video that we've seen earlier today, but also sharing sexual gossip or rumors online, offensive sexual language, and so on. And there've been some research into this kind of behaviors in different parts of the world, and of course we already mentioned some of the data from the UN Women, but also Pew Research Center and many more. And as the situation is developing, and especially in light of everything what happened during the COVID-19 and the increase of such activities online, I think more research needs to be done in this regards. And around the world, there are different ways to deal with this kind of online sexual violence or online sexual harassment. In some jurisdictions, there are specific laws that target such activities, criminalize such activities, but this is still not a standard. Indeed, there are only a few countries in the world that address some of those aspects of online sexual harassment and abuse that I mentioned, and I will possibly discuss some of them a little bit later during the questions and answer times. But I wanted to just very briefly focus on the main challenges pertaining to the issue of online sexual harassment, and identify at least 4 of them. The first is recognizing and identifying the form of online sexual harassment that one faces. This is particularly a challenge where there are no clear laws pertaining to the crime, and the act does not easily fall within the purview of existing crimes. The second challenge is of documenting the act. The evidence can be easily erased, deleted, or otherwise disappear. The evidence may also be stored on servers in different parts of the world, in different jurisdictions, making it more difficult to obtain it. But also another challenge is coming forward with complaints. Reporting online sexual harassment can be as challenging as reporting sexual harassment offline. And we know that sexual harassment offline also is underreported, and the same is being said about online sexual harassment. And again, the data that I mentioned at the very beginning suggested that a very small percentage of women and girls who face such online sexual harassment actually reported to relevant authorities. And the last challenge that I identified is of lack of comprehensive laws on online sexual harassment against women specifically. And globally, there are not many laws that can comprehensively address the nature and scope of online sexual harassment against women and girls particularly. So these are a few very brief examples. And before I conclude, I wanted to mention one very important example, because of course we know that online sexual harassment on its own has very negative effect and upon people who experience this kind of harassment. And very often we talk about psychological consequences, which often translate into physical consequences. But ultimately, it doesn't stop there, because, for example, some of the comments that are made, some of the comments incite violence against individuals and groups, and this is something that we always have to keep in mind. And very brief example is of the Daesh atrocities, and I think we should talk more about the Daesh atrocities also from the perspective of online cyber violence, because on a number of occasions, we've seen online information produced by Daesh as part of the propaganda against, for example, Yazidi women and children, Christian women and children. And some of those statements produced by Daesh members in this propaganda were calling upon others to rape and hurt Yazidi and Christian women and girls, justifying this kind of abuse. And unfortunately, of course, there were people who listened to it, people who were recruited, who were radicalized online, and then went to, for example, Syria and Iraq to commit horrific atrocities against the communities. So as we think about online sexual harassment, online harassment, it does not necessarily only affect the person, or one individual who sees this message, the message is directed at them. The way internet has been used over the recent years, and especially with the online propaganda, radicalization, we see how this kind of narratives also could affect whole communities. And we need more research into especially the use of social media, the use of online platforms by terror organizations such as Daesh, and how they incite violence against Yazidi women and girls specifically. I think that would be a very important study that I would like to see of next year's. But I will stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Evelina. Now, next up is Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to speak alongside such a distinguished group. So as Judy mentioned in her introduction, I'm a research analyst at Freedom House, and I work on a report called Freedom on the Net, which is an annual survey of internet freedom in 70 countries around the world, or about 88% of global internet users. So while Freedom on the Net takes a really holistic look at the global state of internet freedom, analyzing things like obstacles to access or limitations to online content, threats to human rights online, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the really unique risks that women face in this increasingly digital world. So as we all know too well, the internet has provided incredible opportunities, but it has also created a really kind of new frontier of risk. So my expertise is in the Middle East and North Africa, where the internet has provided an alternative space for many women to express themselves in ways that may be prohibited in the offline world. So from the Arab Spring in 2011 to the ongoing protests for freedom in Iran, social media has been a tool of resistance for many women, activists, and minority communities. But it has also been used as a tool of repression by stifling the right to free expression and privacy. So we know that women are far more likely to be the target of tech-facilitated violence, particularly for women in activism or journalists across the Middle East and North Africa. This kind of violence and harassment can be a daily occurrence. So social media, despite all of its benefits, has really kind of perpetuated this violence at scale. For example, a few years ago, 2 very prominent Al Jazeera journalists were harassed by thousands of Saudi Twitter accounts who launched a massive smear campaign against them for their reporting on women's rights. And women not only face online violence from faceless bots or everyday internet users, sometimes these attacks come from government authorities themselves. Government actors, those who are meant to protect the rights and safety of their citizens, far too often are the ones who are perpetuating these acts of violence. So, for example, in Morocco, the websites of state-owned news outlets frequently will publish false or misleading information about journalists or activists who are critical of the government or the royal family. And in Egypt, we've documented a really sustained crackdown on female TikTokers, and dozens of women have been jailed just in the last year alone for their online content. We've also seen governments use really powerful digital tools to violate privacy and surveil women in politics, activists, bloggers, and women belonging to ethnic or religious minorities. So, for example, to go back to Iran, amid the ongoing protests, there have been credible reports that the regime has been using sophisticated surveillance technology and facial recognition tools to identify and penalize protesters, as well as women who are just bravely violating Iran's mandatory hijab laws. So these kinds of tools like facial recognition technology are absolutely ripe for abuse. They present really grave threats to free speech, freedom of association, and assembly. Furthermore, when they get into the hands of authoritarians known for their human rights abuses, the consequences can be quite devastating, particularly for women who may belong to ethnic or religious minorities. So another example, this facial recognition tech that has been used against Iranians was sold to the Iranian regime by Chinese tech companies who had also sold these tools to the Chinese government to use against members of the ethnic Uyghur population in Xinjiang. So our Freedom on the Net China report found that members of China's religious and ethnic minority groups are among the most vulnerable to extralegal detention, torture, and killing due to their online activity. So in Xinjiang, some of the estimated 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims have been taken to re-education camps as a result of their internet use. So I know I've painted quite a grim picture here about the the risks and threats to the human rights of girls and women online, but I'll just close by saying that the rights and safety of girls and women is a really crucial component to this overall fight for internet freedom. And more is certainly needed to ensure that a free and open internet can be just that it can provide immense opportunity, not harm, to girls and women, no matter where they reside.
Thank you for that positive comment. Thank you, Catherine. Now, Bina.
Thank you very much, and really happy to be here with all the other esteemed speakers. I represent a community called the Dalit community in this region, South Asia region. We're one of the most marginalized community, formerly known as untouchables. Many of you must have heard of the community. It's a huge number, 260 million. So if we're looking at women, that's almost 50% of 260 million. So that's a huge population. Access to technology, as we know, is extremely difficult for communities, considering that this year's CSW also is looking at rural women. So if you're looking at rural women and access to technology and the intersection of that, it's almost virtually nil. One of our studies that we did post-COVID and access to higher education is when we look at policy and we look at how policy is made right after the COVID, when there was a shutdown and many of the physical classes went virtual, a large proportion of the young youth who couldn't afford either, if they had a smartphone, they didn't have data, and if they had and some of them didn't even have access to smartphone or computers because many of them stayed in hostels to study. And when they went back home, they didn't have access to technology. And therefore, many of them had to lose 1 year of their education or 2 years of their education just because they did not have access to technology. So that's far more, far-reaching impact on on the community, and specifically youth from the community. We also found that in a family, if there is one smartphone, and if there are two children, one a boy and one girl, to attend online classes, the smartphone would be given to the boy rather than the girl, because, you know, families prefer to educate their boy child rather than the girl child. And again, women, young girls did not have access to technology. So there are several examples like this to show how technology has been, of course, it has played some, it has given access to many of the younger people to have a voice on the internet, considering that, you know, media doesn't cover our issues. But on the other hand, it has also been very difficult to access technology for many from the community. We know that social media has provided a space, a platform, considering mainstream media does not cover many of these issues. But this has also created a lot of hate speech. I think Catherine touched on how different communities, are affected. Similarly, Dalits are affected. There's a lot of abuse on women. But if you look at the abuse that are casteist and racist towards us, many times they talk about color being dark, using that as an abuse. So many times there are colored statements, there are casteist abuse that goes on online, and hate speech specifically referring to your caste or your location. So the abuse is further used to not just talk about the issue, or to, if you want to criticize an issue, but also the person who they want to criticize, and specifically using these kind of statements. It is sometimes, if we look at social media platforms, and if you look at some of the social media platforms, they have taken into account some of this, like, for example, Twitter India has also added caste. We have seen across board, several companies are recognizing caste as one form of, recognizing caste in a protected category. But still, we have a long way to go in terms of how we can have spaces where we can talk about our issues without having a backlash. And there is, over the last few years, an increase in violence on women on online platforms, specifically because of the location. So there is an intersectionality of patriarchy, of casteist abuse, and this is something that we have to face offline. But lately we are facing the same thing, because it is obviously a reflection of what is happening on the ground. So I would just like to give one or two recommendations. We respect that people recognize, we have to recognize, first of all, that there is very casteist abuse, specifically for women coming from the marginalized community. So there has to be a no tolerance of abuse online. There has to be accessible. It has to be made, technology has to be made accessible, and how we can utilize to further education for younger people to access higher education. I think that is really important. There has to be digital accountability. Who is accountable? Right now, perpetrators just go free. They can say what they want and don't face any kind of, so there's a high level of impunity online. And we see this, again, I'm mentioning that we see this as a reflection of what is happening offline. And so we request that there has to be some accountability mechanism set, so that members from the marginalized communities do not, face this kind of violence online. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Veena. So now I'd like to be asking the panelists questions to hone in on the issues. So while I'll direct a question to one of the panelists, the other panelists will weigh in if they wish to add anything. I'd like to start with Catherine. Catherine, how has the internet, social media facilitated gender-based violence online? And what are the biggest risks for women and girls online?
That's a great question. And I think, we could spend hours discussing this. I'll do my best to keep this brief, but As I mentioned in my intro, I think, sophisticated technology and social media more generally has really facilitated gender-based violence at a much more massive scale than offline. So I talked about the harms of, facial recognition, but other kinds of spyware, geolocation tracking tools allow bad actors, whether that be intimate partners, government or security authorities, to really more easily surveil and harass women, particularly those, who may be considered critics of the government or members of certain ethnic or religious communities or LGBTQI people. So it's these kinds of tools that have also, facilitated intimate partner violence, domestic violence. Furthermore, with the rise of automation, trolls and bots and everyday social media users can harass an individual on social media hundreds of times within just a few hours or days. And then I think second is really the lack of adequate safeguards, such as robust data protection laws and gender-based violence legislation that fails to address online harms really allows perpetrators of this violence to go unpunished. So to date, I believe that Tunisia is the only country in the MENA region that has a violence against women law that is expansive enough to include some protections for online violence. But even in countries with these strong right to privacy laws, the lack of specific provisions to address technology facilitated violations, such as, I think, as was mentioned, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, can make it really hard for the judicial system to recognize or kind of act on any harassment online.
Great. Anything to add from the other panelists? Okay, let me move then to the second question, and that's directed to Bina. Bina, what have been the reactive and proactive responses your community has taken? And are there any successes or difficulties you'd like to share with us?
Thanks. Yes, it's always a challenge, Judith, for communities, coming from the marginalized sections, whether it's Dalits or tribal communities, of course, minorities as well. In many of these countries, it's the right wing, so that only exacerbates the issues that we face. So challenges will continue, like I mentioned earlier as well. But what are some of the solutions that we're taking? We are working very closely with companies like Twitter and other social media platforms to have caste as a protected category. That has been done in India. And, this was earlier, like 1 year back, when we could work with Twitter, where, they have caste as, when you want to complain against hate speech, you have caste as one category where you can choose that it was a caste abuse. So we are trying to look at how social media platforms can improve, the community standards to include caste as well. I'm sure race is there already in many of these platforms, but to also look at the social context in the regions that we come from. So that is very important. We're continuing to work with these companies, but we're also looking at how we can have some kind of a law that says that, should be reflective of this. And that is what we're not seeing. That is a challenge where at the ground level, physically, there's a high level of impunity, and that same impunity continues online. So how do we address that? How do we ensure that, people can just give me a rape threat and then get away with it? It's not okay. So how do we do that? How do we build? How do we push for both civil society, governments to ensure that if something like this happens, and if there's a threat based on my social location and as a woman, then what can be done about it? And if there is a complaint that is filed, can those complaints really result in something? So this high level of impunity is how do we reduce that, and how do we have some kind of strong accountability measures to address that?
Right. Have you done any work on training people on how to use social media safely?
Yes, there are many organizations that we are tied up with, who's supporting and ensuring that we use these mediums safely. But let's remember one thing, Judith, that for the largest amount of time, since the last so many decades, mainstream media has totally invisibilized issues of the marginalized. So social media in some way has given that medium. So I must acknowledge that given that medium to talk about our issues for youth to become young digital activists on one side. So it has provided some playing field. I won't say level playing field, but some playing field. It has provided that, and we must acknowledge that. And I think that space is very, very critical and important to bring our issues out. But some way, because that is there, that space is there, it is not in some way, we don't want too much of regulation as well, but we need some kind of mechanism. So yes, we are training younger people how to use social media. We also are, we do tie up with other organizations that are giving this trainings, but we have to do much more on that front.
Great. Let me ask a question to Evelina. How can we address some of these challenges? And is the law the answer? Can the law keep up with all the challenges technology poses, and technology keeps on changing?
Thank you very much, Judith. And indeed, it is a massive question. Not all the challenges that we see can be addressed with law, and also, as you said, as the technology changes, the law cannot keep up with all the changes, all the developments. And so I think we also, apart from focusing on introducing new laws, criminalizing certain activities online, we need to focus on education, awareness raising, especially about the effects of this kind of online activity upon other people. Because I think the more we talk about, I think the more there will be an understanding of the issue, and hopefully, of course, leading towards change. But it is a very difficult one. Very often we see in the news stories of especially young people, teenagers, who resort to committing suicide after being bullied, harassed online for a very long time. And we hear about those stories way too late, when something tragic already happened, rather than focusing on the very many challenges that young people, especially young people, face online, and how it affects their life, and trying to help them with it and throughout this horrible process. But I wanted also to mention a few interesting laws, because indeed laws are developing around the world to address the different challenges faced by people online, including by women online. And I mention a number of different online harassment, types of online harassment, or cyber harassment, cyber violence, however we call it. And indeed, there are many laws that can be used to address them. And for example, earlier this year, I was looking into online sexual harassment of women and trying to identify the different laws around the world. And as I was doing this research, I found that, for example, in India, there are several laws that can be used to address those crimes. But just to emphasize, the laws are there, but it does not necessarily mean that they are being implemented or they are being used the right way. That's a different story. But at least on the first instance, there are certain laws that can be used. And for example, there are laws that can address the issue of image-based sexual abuse. So, for example, there are laws that prohibit the publishing or transmitting of obscene material in electronic form. There are also laws punishing the publishing and transmission of material containing sexually explicit act in electronic form. There are laws on defamation that can be potentially used in such cases. There are also laws that specifically protect women rather than anyone. So, for example, one of the provisions is criminalizing the act of capturing or disseminating pictures of a woman engaging in a private act without her consent. That's actually an existing provision, and thus there are provisions on voyeurism. There are also provisions relating to word or gesture or act intended to insult the modesty of a woman, and of course those laws exists can be used for good, but can be abused as well. I think we need to understand it, the issue. But there is also law in relation to indecent representation of a woman. So several very interesting provisions that could be analyzed. And again, I'm very happy to share some of those provisions later on. There are very interesting laws in the UK as well, and that could be analyzed and could be mirrored for other countries. And there are several laws that are being discussed right now. And just maybe an example from Scotland. In Scotland, the law is slightly different than, for example, in England and Wales. And in Scotland, there are laws that criminalize sending unsolicited sexual content online. So there are various names for this kind of crime. One of this cyberflashing. So if you send an unsolicited image of a private part, for example, that would be criminalized, or that this is currently criminalized in Scotland, but not yet in England and Wales, although there are proposals to criminalize such act right now as well. There are, of course, laws on harassment and stalking and voyeurism, again, both in Scotland, but also in England and Wales. There are also laws in relation that can be addressed to the crimes of sexual coercion or extortion or sextortion. There are laws, there are currently several reforms that are being considered. For example, one of those crimes is indeed for England and Wales of cyberflashing, the crime that is already in existence in Scotland. Another proposed offense is, for example, of encouraging or assisting serious self-harm. So, for example, that could be, again, a message sent online telling another person that if I was you, I would kill myself or something like that. So again, this could be potentially covered by this kind of provision. There are also offenses that are being considered to criminalize sending knowingly false, persistent, or threatening communication, again, to cause harm, harassment, and other psychological effects it may have. So there are many provisions that are being considered right now, but I would like to give yet another example of, and especially that relates to another question that was asked about using social media safely, because generally speaking, I believe that it is very difficult to use social media safely. We may be doing our best to use social media safely, but there are so many dangers there, and we may not necessarily be instigating any of them, but they will be coming our way. And in the UK, there is a piece of legislation called the Online Safety Bill, and there are also currently being considered some reforms to it as well. But one of the provisions that was introduced, and it became law, was to ensure that there is an age verification for certain content, and that was in relation to pornographic content. And that's what the government promised. It was introduced, it became law. But unfortunately, as some developers started working on how this could work, how this age verification could work, the government took a U-turn on it and said that, currently it is too difficult to do it, we cannot proceed with it, despite the fact that the obligation to do it was already included in the law. And those developers who were working on this technology took the UK government to court, because of course this is the law, this is the promise made, and they already spent also a lot of money trying to develop this kind of technology to make sure that, for example, children cannot access pornographic content, and that was one of the promises of the Tory government. So this is just one example how something could have been done to make the digital world safer, especially for children. There was a specific promise from the government, but unfortunately they took a U-turn without any proper justification, because the argument that this is not going to work. was proved wrong by the developers who said that this is workable. And indeed, there is such technology in other countries. So it's all about the will, and obviously there's certain interest that that prevents the government to act on its promise. So it's just one example of what could have been done, but unfortunately the government did not proceed with it yet. So we have in the law the promise to introduce age verification, but nothing in practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you brought up a lot of issues, and it leads to my next question I want to address to all three of you. Why are these concerns too often not addressed? Is it because what happens offline to women and their invisibility goes online? Catherine, is it the lack of data collection? Is it the lack of agreement on what definitions are? Why is it also often, this issue so often not addressed? Who wants to take that first? Evelina.
If I would just start it off. I think one of the issues is indeed violence against women and girls in general is being ignored or not recognized for what it is. We often hear about, yes, we need to do something more about violence against women, but unfortunately it never meets with the response it requires. But one of the issues that I recently faced, something that I noticed as a very big obstacle is, I think sometimes also the understanding of freedom of speech and what speech is protected. And I think it was became even more prominent, especially in the US. And I'll just give you a very brief example without naming anyone, but I was working on a proposal for a side event. And in that proposal, and the proposal, the whole side event was about the situation of the Yazidi women and girls, and the Daesh atrocities, the horrific atrocities, and it mentioned that the ideology of Daesh still persists, is still there, and needs to be combated. And one of the comments I received from an official was that we cannot mention combating the Daesh ideology because it encroaches upon freedom of speech. And then, of course, yes, of course, when we talk about ideology, we are talking about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but ultimately is the ideology of Daesh, which calls upon the rape of the Yazidi women and girls, the killings of Yazidi women and girls, beheadings, and the destruction of the whole community. Is it protected? Should it be protected? Is there anything we can do about it? So I think this raised lots of different questions, but at the time also it was not enough time to discuss it, and I dropped it. But it just raises so many red flags for me, that if we allow this kind of ideology to be distributed online, are we really surprised that we are in a situation where there is so much online sexual harassment, online harassment in general? I think this is all predictable, because if we protect any kind of speech, if you're online, you can say anything and it's fine because it's your freedom of speech. What are we expecting to see? So this is just, of course, an extreme example and of the Daesh ideology. But if we cannot say a sentence that we want to combat the ideology of Daesh, if this is being seen as it attacks freedom of speech, I don't know how we can address anything else, because this is a clear example, black and white. This is something that we shouldn't be protecting within the purview of freedom of speech. So I think this debate about freedom of speech, I think it's going to continue to be a big one, and we'll always see some kind of challenge there. And from my point of view, this is very concerning, because I would never want to be seen as allowing anyone like Daesh to continue using the sacrosanct freedom of speech, freedom of expression to incite violence against women, girls, incite violence against communities such as the Yazidi community or Christians or others. It shouldn't be accepted as within the protection.
It's like hate speech and incitement to violence.
Yes, hate speech is another one I'll briefly mention. Hate speech is something that, for example, here in the UK, we have laws in relation to hate speech. We have them in many European countries. But again, I remember having some discussions with officials in the US. And again, the hate speech issue was being seen, okay, we don't want to go there. So really, different countries deal with it differently. Right. And we see those issues differently. It's connected with the history, with so many different reasons for it. But ultimately, then when we come to such difficult issues where something needs to be done, I think this is where we don't know how to proceed with it or how to address it. But I'll stop here.
You've raised so many questions. Catherine, do you want to comment on this, especially data collection and what you found?
Yeah, I mean, let me just clarify quickly. So as folks have mentioned, of course, we know that, cases of gender-based violence, either online or offline, are often, underreported. So if we're talking about kind of the stats and data from that side, we know that those numbers often are not actually capturing the dramatic level. But when I mention data collection, I'm talking specifically about how people's personal identifying information that you share online. So when you download an app or sign up for a social media app platform or, go to a website, how the internet is collecting all of our information. And in certain countries, without proper data protection laws or these kinds of safeguards, that data, so that identifying information, it could be, your full legal name, sensitive medical data, geolocation data. When there isn't the proper safeguards in place, that data can be used and abused by government agencies, by telecommunications companies. And so I think that's a really critical problem when we're talking about facilitating online violence against women. For example, certain countries may have really kind of harmful laws where they will force tech companies to hand over user data to government agencies, who then can go and use that data to track down, an activist or a journalist or members of ethnic minorities to target them. So when I'm speaking of data collection, it's often more in this kind of negative light, especially in lack of these kind of robust protections.
Okay. Bina, do you have anything you want to add?
Yes. So just to, I totally agree with Evelina. There's a lot of laws in India, but that's also a problem, right? There's no point in having policy if it's not implemented. So I think somewhere we have to not just say that we need a policy or a law, but how that is really useful and implemented for the community. So there's a big question and there's a big gap, and specifically with regard or with reference to online violence against women, Dalit women, or women from the most marginalized communities. But just to say that, why this is not addressed, we've had several instances where, Dalit women have complained to that specific platform, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. And the most that they can do is just block that person or remove that person's account. Post that, what happens is, passing the buck, that it's not our job to do this now. We're just getting that person, and probably 1 month later, that person is back on the platform and back and abusing. So where does the buck stop? Is it stopping with these platforms, or because it is a criminal case? If that same thing happened offline, and we can file a criminal case if you're abusive, right? And specifically if you're abusing casteist abuse, there are specific laws in the country that deal with it. So why aren't we taking it seriously when it's happening online? So there I feel we really need to specifically say that where does the buck stop? Isn't it also the responsibility, according to me, of these online platforms to actually flag out these cases where, in most of the cases, they are men, and in several cases, there are women from other dominant communities also who abuse. So isn't it the responsibility of these platforms to also report this to that specific, country, wherever they're based or wherever this abuse is taking place, that these are some of the habitual offenders, they need to be tracked, they need to be, I think that is not really happening. And therefore, many of these perpetrators get away with just being blocked for a month, and then they come with another name, they come with another, account, and then they start doing it all over again until, again, they're blocked. So I think somewhere there we need to see where, and several of the time the cases fall in between the cracks, because it's not my problem. Now you complain to the police and let the police take it over. But there has to be some way that they have to connect to make sure that that person or the perpetrators don't continue to do this in other forms. So I think this is also one major problem that we have to deal with.
Given that, I'm sorry.
I was just going to quickly respond to something Bina said, and I was just so glad to hear you say that you've been working at times with tech companies, because I think they have such an important role to play in this conversation. One thing that, I've seen, especially with Meta, is kind of their lack of engagement with local civil society on digital rights and things like this, and specifically, not having the capacity to work in non-English languages. So there's really kind of poor, Arabic content moderation that we see across Arabic speaking countries. And this has led, like you're saying, to either cases falling through the cracks because the people who are moderating the content don't understand what is being said or how it's harmful. And then on the other hand, there's very arbitrary and non-transparent, censorship of legitimate protected speech, because these companies haven't put in the time to build up the capacity working with, more local or regional experts who fully understand either the language or the context or the situation for girls and women. So it's great to hear that you're working with those companies on this.
I just have a follow-up question. Given the responses or non-responses from tech companies and the laws that are not enacted, what are the best things for civil society to do? And what has been done that has been successful? What are things that we can do and have been done? Who wants to take that first? Olena?
Thank you very much. I think I would just start maybe with what can be done in terms of individuals and civil society organization. And one of the first steps would be indeed to contact your representatives who are there to also listen to you and hopefully take forward your recommendations. And ultimately, it will all depend on the information that we have, the quality of the data, and any kind of research that we produce in terms of the challenges faced. But ultimately, at least here in the UK Parliament, we can see how powerful such research can be, and there are many politicians willing to listen. Whether then, of course, the government will act upon, that's a different story. But engaging politicians, engaging representatives for your constituency, at least how it works in the UK, but it will depend, or it will be different among the different jurisdictions. And again, a good example is really the online safety bill, because some of the provisions in that bill, and indeed also the age verification, was advocated for by the civil society. There were so many organizations explaining how it could work, and they were the driving force behind this provision, and ultimately it became law. So it was one of the, I would say, most successful campaigns that we've seen in relation to amendments or provisions to a bill in recent years. Again, right now the situation is that it's still not implemented, and the government did not follow through with it. But ultimately, we saw how powerful the civil society can be with their advocacy and engaging legislators, and ultimately, of course, then reaching the government that agreed upon them. So I think there are so many individuals who can make a change, and among them are of course legislators. So reaching out to them, I would say that's something that anyone can do. You don't need to have experience in engaging politicians. Sometimes it starts with a simple email, but it can go far. So that's my recommendation.
You know, do you have anything you want to add there? It looks like you do.
Yeah, I think already I mentioned that we work with the tech companies, but just to say, I won't name the company, but one of the companies that we were working with, actually, we had a discussion on what is violence. Like, what is the extent of violence? Like, for example, if somebody from a non-minority community is saying something on the minority community, then that's violence. But if a minority community is responding to that in also violent way, can that be violence? So there was a lot, and I was a little bit, I don't know what to say, but I was a little bit confused when I had this discussion with them, because I was wondering, like, why are they having this discussion? And it was at a very high level. So somewhere I feel that there has to be more conversation, with practitioners as well as people who are in these tech companies, because most of the times they don't know the lived realities on the ground. So how do we have this conversation and continue to have these conversations? We may not come up with anything immediately, but at least if we continue to have these conversations, at some point, they will understand the context that we are in. And it is so important to have that context, like they have to know caste in this region. If you don't know caste, then you wouldn't know what you can do online, right? So I think that is so important. Evelyn mentioned about the ESD women, unless they know that context, so I think somewhere those conversations have to continue with the tech companies. But also I think we need to put pressure from different sources, like because I'm a Dalit woman coming from the Dalit, it cannot be just me speaking about that, but other people should feel it important, other civil society who are not working on the issues, but feel it important, that unless we center the discussion on the most marginalized, and when we're talking about policy, when we're talking about measures, we can have very good measures if we think of the most marginalized and keep them as the center of our conversations. I think it is so critical to come up with some policies.
Yeah, I'm curious, do any of you know NGOs who are specifically working in this area? Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, for Freedom on the Net, we partner with digital rights organizations across the world who help, produce these country reports. And one thing that I think is really valuable is a lot of these kind of, internet freedom, digital rights groups are doing a lot of really good engagement around digital literacy. So I think, even in most places, the kind of, and maybe this is changing, it's been a while since I've been in school, but, I didn't ever learn, how to tell the difference between, misinformation and real vetted information. And it's just little things like that, or, being able to kind of read a tech company platform's terms of service and being able to understand these things that now, since our world is so online, control so much of it. I think it's really, really critical. And there are some great organizations that are doing exactly this, doing digital literacy for adults, doing digital literacy in like middle education. And I think those are really important steps just to kind of disperse this knowledge so people then become aware of, what are my rights? What are the issues? What do I need to advocate for? So yeah, that's one thing.
Great. Let me ask one other question. Do we have any positive stories we want to highlight to everybody to talk about? Bina.
Yes. I also acknowledge that, these platforms or technology actually gives us a space, to vent out our issues. We may not be able to go out on the streets and protest, but online we can do it so easy with very less resources. So we have to acknowledge that this space is really important. Access to technology is really critical. We can reach the most marginalized through technology. if it is, we want to do an online course or a class for somebody sitting in the middle of nowhere in India or in South Asia, it's possible through technology. So I think I really, really appreciate that. And just like Catherine said, that technology is going to be more and more, everything is going to be, technology driven. So yes, we are able to use that positively for whether it be education, whether it be, but I think it's really important to ensure that we make it accessible to everyone. And I think that is where we need to put our resources in. That is where we need to see how it's going to be accessible, and how, even if a government, like post-COVID, they just shut down and they just moved everything online without thinking that there are people who don't have access to internet. There are people who don't have, you go a few kilometers away from the capital city of India and the internet doesn't work. So how can a person attend classes? So I think somewhere, while it is really great that we could go online and, classes could go online, but there were a lot of people who did not have that access. So I think it's important, while we can use it positively, how do we ensure that we give access to, I think that is where we need to really work towards.
Great. Very, very briefly, I want you three to answer this question. What is the question you'd want to ask the audience out there?
Sorry, I didn't get you, Judith. Can you repeat that?
What is a question that you'd want to ask the audience? What are you curious about from the audience?
Maybe if I may just very briefly ask, I may have missed it, but of course, it would be interesting to know, first of all, the results of the question that you asked at the very beginning, whether they've been victims of, whether the audience or anyone from the audience has been a victim of online harassment or know anyone, and to know the statistics. And then, of course, it would be good to hear about some of the examples of what kind of online harassment they experienced, because I think many of us have experienced some kind of online harassment. We may just push it to the side and forget about it, but especially on Twitter, I can give you many examples of the online harassment that I experienced. But I think it would be great to hear from the audience as well about their experiences.
Great. Catherine or Bina, do you have a question you'd like to know that you'd like to ask the audience? Or should we move directly to the audience questions? Okay, Merritt.
Thank you so much, panel, for that wonderful information, and did want to clarify that the response to the poll, 56% of those who were surveyed and responded said yes, that they have experienced online violence or know someone who has. And I would anticipate that number, as we move forward from 2023 on, will continue to increase, but 56% is 56% too much. Mm-hmm. So we do have some additional questions from those who are watching with us, both in Whova and online today on Zoom. One wrote and asked if you could clarify and provide a definition of Daesh.
Evelina, can you answer that?
The definition of Daesh. Daesh is the Islamic State, ISIL, a terror organization, non-state actor who committed genocide against the Yazidis, Christians, and other religious or belief minorities, with some of the most horrific atrocities perpetrated back in 2014 with the attack on Sinjar on the 3rd of August 2014. Thousands were killed, thousands were abducted, especially women and girls, for sex slavery. To this day, 2,700 Yazidi women and children are still missing. We're talking about over 8 years of abuse and living with the perpetrators, if they're alive. There are several mass graves that have been uncovered with bodies of thousands of people as well. And thousands of boys were abducted, turned into child soldiers. I'm sure that many of the attendees will remember some of the stories that we've seen back in 2014, 2015 of beheadings, especially of the 21 martyrs on a Libyan beach who were beheaded by Daesh fighters. Back then, we've seen lots of videos as well of burning people in metal cages, throwing them from high buildings. So some of the most horrific atrocities that we've seen in recent years. And if you never heard of Daesh, I will make sure that we'll distribute few of my articles covering the situation of and the atrocities of Daesh. It's been some time since we've seen information on news, but nonetheless, some of the worst atrocities seen in recent years.
Merit, another question?
Yeah, so another one of our attendees writes, how is cyber violence handled that occurs within faith communities?
Who would like to take that?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. They write, how is cyber violence handled that occurs within faith communities? So within religious context, how is cyber violence being addressed?
Yeah, I think maybe the question is clarification, but do we mean by religious communities, how religious communities handle such cases, or whether, yes?
I believe that that is the context of the question. So within a faith community, if there is an incident within those that are part of that body of believers, that if there is a cyber violence situation, how would it then be addressed? But I think a follow-up to that would also be, how can those of us in faith communities be an active part of responding on an advocacy level? So I think maybe a two-part question. First, how can we handle when it happens within the community itself? And second, how can faith communities rise up to be advocates?
Yes,
and I'd imagine a little bit to say religious and ethnic minorities.
Maybe just starting with if the perpetrator is from the same community, I think one of the options would be, of course, to contact, I don't know, the heads of the leaders of the community to try to engage on the topic. But ultimately, of course, we need to forget that there are authorities that deal with such issues as well, and many individuals may not feel empowered to report somebody to the community or to the leaders in the community. But if indeed any of the activities fall within the purview of any of the crimes or offenses that we discussed, that person has rights to report it and to make sure that those are being investigated, and of course further consequences follow. So you don't have to rely only on leaders within a community. You have rights, and I think understanding your rights and understanding the options, I think this is very, very important. You don't have to keep it for yourself. You don't have to rely on just leaders within a community. There are others who will listen, and there are also, depending on the country, there are also places where you can access additional help and advice in terms of what can be done. So that there are, in certain countries, again, there are websites where you can find further information. For example, in Sweden, I found that they have incredible resources for people to understand whether what they faced online is a crime, and if so, what are the options, where you can access help, whether help with your mental also consequences of this kind of abuse or harassment, or how to take it forward to make sure that you see some kind of justice being done as well. So it's worth looking into what is available in your country and then to take it forward. But I think it's important to make sure that you are not left alone with what you are facing, and if you need assistance, please ask for it. Do not stay alone with it all.
Right. It seems to me that touches again on what we talked about before, the importance of awareness campaigns in communities. And Bina, can you talk about that, or anything about awareness campaigns in the Dalit community to make sure they understand the issues and their resources?
Yeah, so we're not so much into awareness building, but there is some information that we give out when we have these discussions with tech companies. We before that we have some discussion amongst the community members to see what we can demand and how we can work together. But I think we need to have more awareness campaigns to look at both how we can use online media positively, but also what are the harmful effects of that. So we've not really got into that, but that's something that we are working on.
Merit, are there other questions?
Thank you. There's a follow-up that aligns, I believe, with what we just discussed, but it's related to specific training or guidelines that might exist for young girls and young women on how to be more cautious or safe online, particularly in the use of social media. What resources are available that we can use to equip the next generation?
I think there are specific companies that are, specific organizations that look at safety online, who are giving trainings, who are also giving trainings, I know, to parents on how they can monitor what their children are seeing online and how they can sort of ensure that they don't get, they're able to control what they're viewing online. I think there is some, I do know an organization that works on that. There are some organizations that are doing it. And I think more and more we need to know, because, earlier on, I remember when I was growing up, we probably didn't have that kind of access to internet. But today, if you ask a 10-year-old, or probably a child is born, there's an ad where the child is born holding a phone in his hand. It's like that, right? Children, I see a lot of parents who they want to keep the child busy, so they just give a phone, and it's really bad though. But children are they know how to swipe on the, a 1-year-old knows how to swipe the iPhone and open the phone. That's how into tech they are. So I think we need to have more and more measures and discussions with parents, teachers, to ensure that children are really, what kind of content are they viewing online, which is going to affect them in a big way in the next decade. So I think that is something that is going to be really critical to this conversations of how do we look at some modules which we can use for both families, children, parents, teachers, to ensure that we minimize the violence that they face.
That's great. And we'll be sure to post these information on our resources page, post on WBA Women and Fork Women Alliance. We'll keep it there. And I see Evelina wants to add something.
If I may just very briefly comment, because of course the question, if I understood it correctly, was how can we make sure that women and girls are safe online, and what kind of guidelines they could be given to be safe online. But I think it's to some extent, it reminds me of some of the conversations that women have sometimes, how to make yourself safer when you walk back home at night, whether you should be walking with a key in your hands just to protect yourself. And the burden is not only on women to make sure that they're safe, because no matter what you do, you cannot protect yourself fully, because there is always some kind of danger that can be out there. And I think education of everyone in terms of what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, and so on. I think we need to focus more on education, and something like violence against women shouldn't be existing in 21st century, not in 2023, and to this extent. And I think I don't want to tell my nieces, and I have 2 wonderful nieces who are 3 and 1, so still tiny, but I don't want to tell them in a few years that when you walk home, make sure that you have sharp key with you and so on. This is not the society I want to live in. This is not the next generation of young women that I want to see. I want them to be safe without having that extra key in their hand. So it's a different kind of conversation in terms of we need to focus on more awareness raising and education in relation to that the issue of the ongoing violence against women, whether online or offline, this should not exist in the 21st century. Just that key in your hand. This is something that men don't have the same problems. They don't have to walk around with keys, and I think we need to address it, because we can do everything what is in our power to make ourselves safe, but it doesn't mean that we are safe.
Catherine, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I really want to just echo everything that's been said. You know, the fact that these conversations still have to happen at such frequency is really kind of a dismay. But one thing that I think this is just timely, when I was listening to the radio this morning, I heard an advertisement from TikTok saying that for children under 18, parents will have this option to limit who their child's phone can connect with and chat with. So it can either be just friends that the parents have to like vet and allow, or it can be no one. And I think that this is showing that tech companies are recognizing, I mean, especially in the US, this has been such a problem. Of course, I'm sure it is all around the world, but you know, it is good that tech companies, I think, are bringing, especially how, you know, online violence is impacting children kind of to the forefront. So there is that positive momentum, at least.
Yeah. The other thing I'm hearing in everyone's comments is the importance of allies and coalition building on this issue. Can't do it ourselves. And we're more powerful together. Are there any other final questions, Merritt?
There was one that was specifically related to freedom of religion or belief. And so some human rights experts fear that this is the biggest challenge that we're facing in that regard, that it impacts all regions and all minorities. And so if that's true, how can we continue to build awareness? You've spoken of several different options, but specifically as it relates to freedom of religion or belief, do you see a connection there, and how can we advocate in that area?
Anyone want to make a comment on that? I mean, I can start talking about how religious minority communities are often the targets of this abuse because they're vulnerable in so many ways. And the importance of reaching out to others, the importance of advocacy. Anybody want to add to that?
I would just briefly comment on that, because I definitely could see it as well, that of course religious belief minorities are very often targeted with such harassment online or offline. And what we see as well is lack of responses, even if such abuse, such harassment is reported, because they belong to religious or belief minorities. And we see that, for example, one of the good examples will be of Pakistan. And this is something that needs to be addressed. And so we need to focus, for example, on education of law enforcement officials who are taking such complaints and take the first report of such incidents, and then of course training how such issues are investigated, and if they are to proceed to court, again, some assistance should be also provided to the individuals, because members of religious or belief communities in many parts of the world, they face such inequalities that they don't have the basic resources in order to be able to address such situations, or for example resources even to pay for a lawyer or any kind of assistance that is required by them. So indeed, religious or belief communities around the world will require extra assistance, and we should, I think, even map what kind of assistance is available to them, whether NGOs providing this kind of assistance with especially legal assistance, or anything else that could be provided to assist them.
I see a comment about, and we should talk about it, the media, both how we work with the media, how we use the media, our own ability to tell stories. Can we talk about that a little bit? I know, who wants to talk about that?
Very, very briefly, and I will stop talking, I promise. I think, again, something what I've seen in relation to religious or belief minorities, some of the narratives that are presented that actually incite further online harassment against certain communities. And so we've seen that in a number of different cases. It was even more visible during the COVID-19 pandemic, when a number of religious or belief communities have been blamed for the spread of COVID-19, and the media also contributed in spreading this kind of misinformation about the communities, and how it unraveled as well on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. So I think media have to take responsibility for the narratives that they spread. There needs to be more education as well among journalists about freedom of religion belief, about religious belief communities, and the effects their narratives that they spread have upon them. But that's yet another topic that I think we should have a separate side event for that.
So we've talked about advocacy with government, we've talked about advocacy with tech companies, we've talked about advocacy with the media, we talked about educating the grassroots, a lot of work. Merit, are there other questions?
Well, just to wrap up, is there one action step you would encourage our attendees to take today, or one resource that you think would be pivotal to them in their advocacy that you would recommend today? So either one step of action they can take, or one resource that you would recommend as we wrap up.
So who wants to start that? Bina.
Yeah, before I go to the action point, one of the things that I'd like to say is that we have to remember that many women are very scared to report. They're afraid to come out and report some of these crimes. So how do we, as civil society, government, agencies, how do we create a safe space offline where, they can report, and how do we encourage more women to come out and report? I think that is very critical, because we see that amongst Dalit women, while, even if it's a physical crime, people are so scared to go to the police station and file an FIR, because that itself is such a daunting task. There is no support from the police. So I think that for me, one of the most important thing, and I'd call on, the government, civil society networks who are working on freedom of speech, who are working on technology and access to technology, to ensure that there is that there is some kind of a safe space that we provide offline that women can go to. Of course, I call on the government, societies, the private sector to have zero tolerance to online abuse, and to make technology more accessible, through either have policies on it or ensure that, we're able to access. I think these are some of the things that immediately I can think of. Thank you.
Great. Catherine or Evelina, any comments?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I'll just do a quick plug of a resource if you're interested in learning more about the state of internet freedom and just human rights online in general. Our Freedom on the Net report, we put it out every year. It covers 70 countries around the world, and you can look at things from like the digital divide that we were talking about earlier, to censorship, to these kind of really invasive threats. And then my, I guess, little call to action, just very much on an individual level, is, I mentioned this before, but the next time you download an app or sign up for a platform, just read the terms of service. Understanding what our rights are and how our data and our personal information is protected is such a small step that can go a really long way.
Evelina.
Thank you. I promise not to say anything else, but I will break this promise now. I think one of the steps that can be taken and could help as well to women, especially women and girls, to talk a little bit more about, or be more open about their experiences, is really to establish some safe spaces for them to talk about what is happening, because it is indeed not only in countries such as, for example, I don't know, Pakistan or Iraq, where of course women face different challenges that, for example, in the UK, US, and so on. It is difficult to talk about any kind of abuse that women suffer, whether offline or online. So it is important for them to have those safe spaces and be able to share their experiences. And of course, any kind of experience, doesn't matter whether we understand it or not, will have some kind of effect on that woman and girl. So listening to others and also guiding them through the response. I think it's crucial, empowering them to be able to share their experiences and seek assistance. Again, abuse, whether offline or online, is underreported. So we need to change that. The more women talk about their experiences, the better it will be. It will help others as well to speak up, and will help us as well to see the true picture of the issue. Because again, the data that we have is normally just a tip of an iceberg.
Right. Mary, I don't think there's any more questions, right? Okay, so I want to thank the panelists for a wonderful, wonderful job. I'm so pleased that we got together, and thank you again. And now I want to turn it back to Merritt.
Yes, thank you again to our wonderful facilitator and our esteemed panelists. It's been so informative, so helpful, and also saddening to gather some of this information. But I think for all of us, being reminded that there are steps that we can take. So I'm thankful to end on this positive note that there are actions that we can take, that there are things that we can do to move this forward in terms of advocacy and action and activism. And did wanted to share just a few quick resources as we wrap up. We'll be brief here. So one of the resources that I wanted to share with you today is a resource called Take It Down. Take It Down is a free resource developed by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children through funding from Meta. Girls under the age of 18 can anonymously use this service to remove sexually explicit images or videos from online environments. And so you can see the website listed there, and I would encourage you to be able to make use of this resource. Of course, we've presented lots of information today, and we know it's impossible for the content to be exhaustive within this limited time frame, but I want to be certain to reference that if you are in crisis today, or you know someone who is a victim of cyber violence and they are struggling mentally, emotionally, the team at the crisis text line is available 24/7 to provide support and resources right now. So you can reach out to them via text, via chat, via WhatsApp. And so if you are struggling, please today do not suffer alone. Please reach out and make that connection so that they can provide support and resources for you. In addition, we're creating an inventory of research and resources which can be accessed online at our website, bwawomen.org. We will also have this available on the For Women's Alliance website. If you have resources that you would like to share, we welcome those contributions. So in addition to having resources here that we will be sharing and that our panelists will be sending for us to add as well, we would encourage you to reach out to us at bwawomen.org/contact and share your resources. We would love to be able to help facilitate adding those and continuing to provide a network of resources that can help you in responding in this area. Truthfully, we are better together. That's why we have events like the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, is that together we are able to take action, together we are able to do more. And it is our hope and our prayer that the collective voices on this call today and those of advocates around the world will lead to change. Women and girls deserve to live in a world that is safe. So may we each take what we receive today and go forth as agents of change. Thank you again for joining us today. It has been a great honor to have this time with you. Judy, did you have a comment?
Yes, I just want to add forwomen.org. That's our online, so you can go to there as well for some information. Thank you.
Absolutely. We also invite you to connect with us on social, and we look forward to answering any additional questions that you have. You can reach out to us again on that contact form, and we'll be happy to connect with the panelists and get answers and responses back to you. But thank you again for being with us today. Go in peace.